What were the lies?
I don't even want to give voice to it because then it goes, oh, they said this, they said that. Anything you read about that was bullshit. The truth was,
when Ben Affleck made a joke about Mexicans during a live interview, he probably expected everyone to laugh and move on like always. But Salma Hayek refused to let his insult about Mexico slide. What started as light conversation quickly became one of the most merciless confrontations ever caught on camera. The type of moment where you forget you are watching entertainment because it feels too real and too important. Why did this interview spiral so completely out of control? Stay tuned, because this is not just entertainment, but a real conversation about power and prejudice and respect. The Latin time comment. The studio lights were bright, and the cameras were rolling when Ben Affleck made a comment that would change everything about the interview, something that started as what he probably thought was harmless banter, but quickly became something much more serious and uncomfortable for everyone watching. He was sitting across from Salma Hayek on a popular talk show, both of them there to promote a film they had worked on together. And the conversation had been flowing smoothly until he decided to make a joke about Mexican actors and their relationship with time, suggesting with a half-smile that there was something called Latin time that made people from Mexico less punctual than their American counterparts in Hollywood. The comment hung in the air like smoke that nobody wanted to breathe, and you could feel the atmosphere in the studio shift immediately from relaxed to tense. Ben framed his words as cultural curiosity rather than criticism, as if he was simply making an observation about differences between working cultures. But the nervous laughter that rippled through the audience revealed that people understood there was something sharper hidden beneath the surface of his so-called joke. Salma did not laugh at all. Her face remained completely still and serious. And instead of letting the moment pass or playing along with the humor like many guests might have done to keep things light, she leaned forward slightly and asked Ben to explain exactly what he meant by that comment, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. But what Salma did next would expose something much deeper than just one awkward joke, war between stereotypes and reality. Ben tried to recover by doubling down on his point, explaining that in his experience Hollywood operated with a certain efficiency and discipline that he had not always observed when working with crews or actors from Mexico, comparing the two cultures as if one was naturally more organized than the other. He spoke about call times and production schedules, about the way American sets ran like clockwork, while implying that Mexican sets were somehow more relaxed or chaotic. And he did all of this while maintaining that friendly tone that suggested he was just sharing honest observations rather than making judgments. Salma let him finish speaking and then systematically began to dismantle his argument piece by piece, asking him if he had ever witnessed American actors showing up late to set, if he had ever seen Hollywood productions run over budget or over schedule, if he had ever experienced unprofessional behavior from people born and raised in the United States. Salma did not raise her voice, but her words carried weight, each question landing like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread wider and wider until the entire conversation had been reframed from casual humor to something far more important, something about accountability and the stories we tell ourselves about other cultures. The power balance in the interview began to shift visibly. You could see it in Ben's body language as he sat back in his chair. You could hear it in the way the audience had stopped laughing entirely and was now watching in complete silence, waiting to see where this conversation would go next. Salma was not angry, but she was absolutely refusing to let the stereotype stand unchallenged. She was taking what could have been brushed off as a thoughtless comment and transforming it into a teaching moment about how casually we assign negative traits to entire groups of people while ignoring the exact same behaviors in our own communities. And the accusations were about to get even more specific and harder to ignore. Work ethic accusations. Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat and tried to clarify his position by suggesting that he was not talking about all Latino actors, but rather about a general cultural difference in approach to work, implying that perhaps the discipline required for major Hollywood productions was simply more embedded in American training and work culture. He mentioned professionalism and commitment, as if these were qualities that naturally belonged more to one group than another. And though he tried to soften his words with careful phrasing, the underlying message was clear enough that everyone in the studio understood what he was really saying about Latino actors and their supposed lack of discipline. Salma did not let this pass either. She looked directly at Ben and asked him to name specific Latino actors who had demonstrated this lack of professionalism, to give her actual examples rather than vague generalizations about entire populations of people. The question hung there demanding an answer, and when Ben hesitated and tried to redirect by saying he was speaking generally, Salma countered immediately by listing American actors who had famously held up productions, who had shown up unprepared or under the influence, who had caused delays that cost studios millions of dollars, and yet were still celebrated and given chance after chance in the industry. She named incidents that everyone in Hollywood knew about, but rarely discussed publicly, moments where American actors had behaved in ways that would have ended the careers of actors from other countries. And she did this not to shame anyone specifically, but to prove that unprofessional behavior had nothing to do with nationality or ethnicity, and everything to do with individual choices and the protections that fame and power provide. The silence in the studio was now complete. Not even nervous laughter remained, just the uncomfortable quiet of people confronting a truth they had been avoiding. But what Salma revealed next would show how deeply these stereotypes had infected the entire industry. Hollywood's invisible bias. Salma began explaining how stereotypes like the ones Ben had casually mentioned were not just harmless observations, but rather the foundation of systemic bias that affected every aspect of how Latino actors were treated in Hollywood, from the roles they were offered to the way their work was perceived by critics and audiences. She described how these assumptions became normalized over time, how they were repeated in green rooms and casting offices and production meetings until they were accepted as fact, rather than recognized as prejudice, and how this normalization meant that Latino actors had to work twice as hard to prove they possessed the same basic professionalism that was automatically assumed of their white counterparts. She pointed out that framing insults as conversation or cultural curiosity did not make them less harmful, that calling something a joke did not erase the real-world consequences of perpetuating negative stereotypes about entire groups of people. Salma explained how these casual comments reinforced hiring decisions, how they influenced who got callbacks and who got dismissed before even auditioning, how they created a ceiling that Latino talent constantly had to push against, while others simply walked through open doors without even noticing the difference in their experiences. Ben was visibly struggling now. His earlier confidence had evaporated, and he seemed genuinely unprepared for the depth and precision of Salma's response. He had clearly expected this to be a light moment that would pass quickly, but instead, he was being held accountable in real time on live television. The audience was no longer just uncomfortable. Many were nodding in agreement with Salma's points. Some were clearly emotional as they recognized their own experiences in her words, and the energy in the room had transformed from entertainment to education. The discomfort was about to deepen as Salma prepared to reveal the specific ways these biases had shaped her entire career. Breaking the Latina box. Salma shifted the conversation to describe the limited roles that Hollywood had offered her throughout her career, explaining that for Latina actresses, there were essentially 3 boxes they were allowed to occupy, and rarely any opportunity to exist outside of those narrow definitions. She could play the maid, always in the background serving the main characters, grateful for whatever scraps of screen time she received, or she could play the exotic lover and be passionate, but never the romantic lead who got the happy ending and character development, or she could play the criminal, the gang member's girlfriend, or the harmful substance dealer's sister, always connected to violence and poverty, and never given complexity or humanity beyond those stereotypes. These were the options presented to her again and again, roles that reduced her entire identity and the richness of her culture to the most basic and often insulting archetypes that white writers and directors could imagine. Salma then talked about Frida, the biographical film about Mexican artist Frida Kahlo that she had spent 8 years fighting to make. 8 years of being told that a movie about a Mexican painter would never find an audience, that it was too foreign and too specific, and not universal enough for mainstream American viewers. She described the meetings where executives questioned whether anyone would care about this story, where she was asked why she didn't want to make something more accessible, where the word universal was used as code for white and American, while stories about people who looked like her were automatically labeled as niche or ethnic. The struggle to make Frida was not just about one film, but about challenging Hollywood's entire definition of whose stories mattered and whose lives were considered worthy of being told on screen. Salma had to become a producer herself, had to put her own money and reputation on the line, had to fight for every aspect of the production because the industry would not simply hand her the opportunity to tell a story about a brilliant Mexican woman who had changed art history. And the personal attacks she faced went even deeper than just the roles she was offered. Accent, names, and erasure. Ben asked a question that seemed innocent on the surface but revealed another layer of the discrimination Salma had faced. He wondered aloud if she had ever considered changing her name to something easier for American audiences to pronounce and remember. Something that might have helped her career move faster in those early years when she was trying to establish herself. The question assumed that the problem was her name, rather than the industry's unwillingness to learn and respect names that came from non-English backgrounds. Salma turned the question back on him immediately, asking Ben if he had ever been told that Affleck was too difficult or too ethnic, or too anything that required modification to succeed. The answer was obvious, and the point was made. White actors were never asked to erase parts of their identity as the price of admission to the industry. They were allowed to exist fully as themselves, while actors of color were expected to sand down their edges and minimize their differences until they became palatable to white comfort. She explained that keeping her name, Salma Hayek, was an act of resistance, a refusal to participate in her own erasure, a declaration that she would succeed on her own terms or not at all. Every time someone learned to pronounce her name correctly, every time her name appeared on a poster or in credits exactly as it was meant to be, it was a small victory against a system that wanted her to disappear into something more familiar and less threatening to the status quo. The audience erupted into applause, many people rising to their feet in support of her words. And you could see the emotional impact of what she was saying landing not just with Ben, but with everyone watching. What Salma revealed next would make the conversation even more personal and painful. Being forgotten on purpose. Salma called Ben out directly for failing to mention her in past interviews when he talked about important collaborations or memorable projects they had worked on together, for somehow leaving her name out of stories where she had been present and contributed significantly, for acting as if her participation had been minor or forgettable when the reality was quite different from the narrative he had been presenting to the world. She explained that this kind of exclusion was often unintentional, that she did not believe Ben had consciously decided to erase her from those narratives, but that the harm was still real regardless of intention, because being forgotten repeatedly sends a message about whose contributions matter and whose can be overlooked without anyone noticing or caring enough to correct the record. Salma described how this pattern happened not just with Ben, but across the industry. How Latina actresses would work on projects and then watch themselves disappear from the promotional materials or the behind-the-scenes stories or the award season conversations. How they would be present for the work, but absent from the recognition, as if their involvement was somehow less memorable or less worthy of acknowledgement than their white colleagues who had done the exact same work. The emotional weight of long-term erasure became visible on her face as she spoke. You could hear in her voice that this was not about one interview or one slight, but about decades of being made to feel invisible despite her talent and her success, and her undeniable impact on cinema, both in Hollywood and internationally. She talked about watching interviews where projects she had poured her heart into were discussed at length, without her name being mentioned even once, about reading articles that credited everyone except her, about standing in rooms where her ideas were repeated by others who then received praise for thoughts that had originated from her mind. Ben looked genuinely shaken by this revelation. His face had gone pale, and he apologized publicly and sincerely, admitting that he had not thought about how his words or omissions might affect her, that he had not considered the cumulative effect of being left out of stories over and over again until the absence became a pattern that reinforced the idea that her work was somehow less important than his or less central to the projects they had shared. The apology seemed genuine, but Salma's expression suggested that sorry was just the beginning of what needed to happen, and the intersection of gender and ethnicity was about to make the conversation even more complex and uncomfortable. Power, respect, and gender bias. Salma shifted to discussing her journey to becoming a producer, explaining that she had taken on that role not just because she wanted more creative control, but because it was the only way to ensure that stories like hers would actually get made in an industry that was not interested in telling them or investing in them or believing that audiences would care about narratives that centered people who did not look like the executives making the decisions. She described the immediate assumptions that came with her new position, how executives and journalists and even colleagues would ask if her husband, François-Henri Pinault, was funding her projects, as if a successful Latina woman could not possibly have built her own production company through her own work and her own connections and her own understanding of the business and her own vision for what kinds of stories needed to be told. This assumption was never made about male producers, she pointed out with a sharpness in her voice that cut through the remaining tension in the room. Nobody asked Ben or Matt Damon or George Clooney or Brad Pitt if their wives were bankrolling their production companies. Nobody questioned whether they had really earned their positions or whether they truly understood the complexities of producing. But somehow, when a woman, and especially a woman of color, achieved that level of power and independence, the default explanation was that a man must be responsible for her success. Salma talked about media headlines that reduced her accomplishments to luck or marriage, or being in the right place at the right time. Headlines that refused to acknowledge the strategic decisions and hard work and business acumen and years of learning the industry from every possible angle that had actually built her career and her production empire. She explained the crucial difference between having numbers that looked good on paper and actually receiving respect in the rooms where decisions were made. How she could have box office success and critical acclaim and projects that made substantial profits and still be treated as if she was playing at being a producer rather than actually being one who deserved to sit at the table with the men who had been given those seats without ever having to prove themselves first. The double burden of being both female and Latina meant that every achievement was questioned and scrutinized and picked apart, while every failure was used as evidence that she never should have been given the opportunity in the first place, while her white male counterparts were allowed to fail upward and learn on the job without their entire gender or ethnicity being put on trial with each mistake. But nothing prepared the audience for what Salma was about to confront Ben with next, a specific moment that would expose the deepest layer of casual prejudice. The tacos comment. The atmosphere in the studio became even heavier as Salma brought up a specific remark that Ben had made in a previous interview. A comment about Mexico that had involved tacos and stereotypes and the kind of casual racism that often gets dismissed as humor when it comes from someone famous and likable and protected by layers of public goodwill that allows certain people to say things that would destroy others. She did not repeat the exact words at first, but everyone in the audience seemed to know what she was referring to. You could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they remembered or imagined what had been said. And the silence that fell over the room was the kind of complete quiet where even breathing feels too loud, and where every small sound becomes magnified by the tension hanging in the air. Salma looked directly at Ben with an intensity that made it clear she was not going to let this moment pass without full accountability. And she told him that the comment was not a joke, that it was not harmless fun between friends, that it was not the kind of thing that could be brushed aside with an apology and a promise to do better next time, because the damage had already been done, and the message had already been sent to millions of people who heard it. She explained that when someone with Ben's platform and privilege and influence makes those kinds of remarks, it reinforces the idea that Mexico and Mexican people exist primarily for American consumption and American entertainment, that their culture can be reduced to food jokes and lazy assumptions without any consideration for the richness and complexity and profound history that actually defines the country and its people. The comment had positioned Mexico as something less than, something simple and digestible and easily categorized, something that existed for punchlines rather than respect. And Salma was making it clear that this was not about being overly sensitive or unable to take a joke, but about understanding that humor built on reducing entire nations to stereotypes was not actually humor at all, but rather a weapon that maintained hierarchies of power. Ben sat there, unable to respond immediately. His face showed that he understood the seriousness of what was being said, but he struggled to find words that would adequately address the harm he had caused or explain why he had thought it was acceptable in the first place. He admitted fault, said that the comment had been stupid and thoughtless and inexcusable. But when Salma asked him to explain why he had thought it was okay to say in the first place, he could not give a satisfactory answer because there was no good explanation for why casual racism becomes acceptable when it is wrapped in comedy or delivered with a smile from someone the public has decided to like. What came next would be a history lesson that nobody in that studio would ever forget, a reclamation of identity that would shift everything. Defining Mexico beyond stereotypes. Salma began to speak about Mexico in a way that transformed the entire energy of the room. Her voice filled with pride and passion as she outlined the ancient civilizations that had built massive pyramids and developed sophisticated mathematical systems and created calendars more accurate than anything Europe had at the time. Salma talked about the Mayans and the Aztecs, about their contributions to astronomy and agriculture and architecture, about how these were not primitive cultures waiting to be discovered by Europeans, but rather advanced societies with complex governments and rich artistic traditions that deserve to be understood on their own terms, rather than through the lens of conquest and colonization. She listed names that most of the audience had probably never heard before: Mexican writers like Octavio Paz and Juan Rulfo, painters like Diego Rivera and Rufino Tamayo, filmmakers like Alejandro González Iñárritu and Alfonso Cuarón and Guillermo del Toro, who had won multiple Academy Awards and changed the language of cinema itself. Salma described the golden age of Mexican cinema, a period when films from Mexico influenced directors around the world, when Mexican actors were international stars celebrated for their craft rather than reduced to stereotypes, when the country's artistic output was recognized as essential to global culture rather than dismissed as ethnic or niche. She exposed how Hollywood had profited enormously from immigrant creativity, how many of the industry's greatest achievements had come from people who brought perspectives and experiences from outside the United States, how Mexican and Latino talent had enriched American film and television in ways that were rarely acknowledged or credited properly. The argument became historical and cultural and moral all at once. It was no longer just about one comment or one pattern of exclusion, but about the entire way that power structures determine whose contributions get remembered and whose get erased, whose cultures are treated as legitimate sources of art and knowledge, and whose are reduced to punchlines and exotic decoration. The audience sat in absolute silence, absorbing every word. Many people were visibly moved by the depth and breadth of what Salma was teaching them. But now, the question was whether Ben would actually do anything different after this conversation ended. Apology versus action. Ben apologized again, and this time there was something different in his voice, a recognition that went beyond just feeling bad about being called out on television. He seemed to genuinely understand that the problem was not just what he had said, but the entire framework of thinking that had made those comments feel acceptable to him in the first place. He acknowledged his privilege, admitted that he had never had to think about these issues because they had never affected him personally, that he had been able to move through the world and the industry without considering how his casual remarks might reinforce systems that made life harder for people who did not share his advantages. Salma listened to his apology and then explained why apologies alone were not enough to create actual change, why feeling sorry or embarrassed was just the starting point rather than the destination. She told him that the real work happened in the rooms where he had power and influence, in the casting discussions and production meetings and social gatherings where stereotypes were repeated and hiring decisions were made. In those moments, when he could either stay silent and let harmful patterns continue, or speak up and use his position to challenge them, even when it made him uncomfortable or unpopular with his peers. She challenged him directly to commit to doing better, not just in public statements or carefully worded social media posts, but in the actual day-to-day decisions that shaped who got opportunities and whose stories got told and who was remembered and who was forgotten. Ben committed publicly to making those changes, to educating himself further, to being more conscious about representation and inclusion, to using his platform to amplify voices that had been marginalized rather than speaking over them or ignoring them completely. The commitment seemed sincere, but everyone in the room understood that only time would reveal whether these were just words meant to end an uncomfortable situation or actual promises that would lead to meaningful action. What happened next showed that something fundamental had shifted between them, despite the difficulty of the conversation. A shift in power. The tone in the studio began to soften slightly, though the seriousness of the conversation remained present in every word and gesture. You could feel that something had changed between Salma and Ben, even as they continued to sit across from each other under the bright lights, with cameras capturing every moment. Ben admitted to personal insecurity, talked about how his own anxieties about being good enough or smart enough sometimes manifested as jokes at the expense of others, how privilege had allowed him to be careless with his words because he had never faced real consequences for that carelessness, the way that people with less power did every single day. He spoke about realizing in real time during this conversation how much he had taken for granted, how many assumptions he had made without questioning them, how easy it had been to participate in systems of exclusion without even recognizing that was what he was doing, because those systems benefited him and people like him. Salma acknowledged his honesty and reframed the entire conversation as necessary rather than hostile, explaining that this discomfort was actually productive, that being challenged and having to confront your own biases was how growth happened both individually and collectively as an industry and as a society. She made it clear that she was not attacking him personally, but rather refusing to accept patterns that had harmed her and countless others for far too long, that holding people accountable was an act of respect, because it assumed they were capable of doing better once they understood the impact of their actions. The mutual acknowledgement that filled the space between them replaced the earlier defensiveness. Ben stopped trying to justify or explain away his mistakes, and instead simply listened. And Salma stopped having to fight quite so hard, because he was finally hearing what she had been saying all along. The conversation was ending, but the real transformation was only beginning to take shape in ways that would extend far beyond this single interview. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.